Welcome to The Gathering, a podcast for artists and creatives from Arts Lancashire. This is one of 2 episodes commissioned especially for the Lancashire Arts Exchange 2021 and features a conversation with Lancashire-based artist Chantal Oakes. Chantal is a multi-disciplinary artist who uses collaborative arts practice to produce text and moving image. Her piece, Still Lives, a series of digital abstract fine art animations, will feature at the Harris in Preston on the 29th and 30th of September as part of the Lancashire Arts Exchange Augmented Creativity programme.
So I think I stumbled upon the Afro Culture website first, actually, which was a brilliant insight into your thinking and how your work has developed and why you've become an interventionist, which I really love that term. And it just struck me how much of your work is about meeting places and cultural exchanges as well. And I know that obviously you didn't start out as an artist in inverted commas. So I just wondered how you came to meet your own artistic practice. How did you make that transition from what you did before to what you do now?
That's the hardest question, I think, because it's
sorry.
That's all right. No,
it gets easier from now on.
It really made me think about. It was never either or. It was always together. I was fascinated with computers because it's a new language. When I started working on computers, you had to type in a language, which became HTML, funnily enough, to make it do what you wanted it to do. So it's a new language, and that was all very exciting, and I really enjoyed learning that and learning how to use the computer and screen and stuff. But alongside that, I was always doing art in its most sort of traditional sense: drawing, painting, photography, then cine film.
And were you just doing that for yourself, or were you doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I was told from a quite young age that there's absolutely no money in art, so you need to be able to support yourself. I just wanted to make pictures or images. Just wanted to physically do art. That was my sort of thing that I personally wanted to do. But I really enjoyed, in terms of working, learning the language, learning how to make a machine do in the graphic sense what I wanted it to do. That was the pull for that. So I was quite happy doing both. I was quite happy that the graphics was paying for me to make little cine films, take photographs, get a good camera, all of those sorts of stuff. And then computers they just built and built and built the capacity for what you could do, the coding, from the keyboards. Then you had a mouse, then you had a tablet, then you could use your voice to make a computer do things. So it was, although looking back it seems like a very short amount of time, actually that's about 30 years of technology building into sort of some of the stuff that we see today.
So you've been on that journey with technology, really, and it's almost been like your training ground. The work that you were doing in graphic design has almost trained you alongside all the technology to then be able to make art with that technology as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would say in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, that's when it's become more art than graphic, in terms of my career anyway.
So I think that's really interesting, because there are so many different ways into the arts, and I think it's not linear, is it? And we tend to think that you've got to do a degree in an art subject and then you go from there, but often that is not actually how it works. So I'm always really interested in the moment that people make that transition or make that decision in their minds to follow art as a direction, or for it to become a large part of their career, I guess. I mean, obviously you've described why it was easy for you to make the transition, I guess, into the type of art that you make, but sort of what were the moments along the way that supported your journey in terms of the experiences that you had or the people that you met that made you move towards making art on commission or responding to call outs? Or how did you make that transition, and who helped you along the way?
Well, talk about the negative sort of help first. It was how in graphics, and it was quite excluding. I always felt that I was doing it for somebody else's specific sort of guidelines, and it was always about a product. It was never about the thing that you were making.
It was the end result.
Yeah. And then when I moved to Preston, there wasn't a big sort of graphics industry here. Creative industries weren't a thing here, really. And so, like, oh, well, if I can't do that, maybe I can do what I want to do, which is something to do with making images on a more sort of personal level. And then an art group started, Black Artists Group started, driven by Lubaina Himid, who works at the university, who wanted to make any sort of art scene that there was in Preston more diverse. I think that was the main sort of goal, and to introduce people to this world of art and find ways that they could participate, really. So I joined that art group. That's what Kitchen Sink came from, a way of black artists to sort of support themselves and make projects. So that's how I started. And then I had a baby, so everything sort of stopped for a little while. And so to get back into it, I decided that because that's what I wanted to do more of and was easier for me to do, image making using computers as well. So that's when I went and did the MA at the university.
The University of Central Lancashire?
Yeah.
It was fine arts in, was it something about archive, I think I read?
Archive intervention.
Archive intervention, yeah. That's really interesting.
It was, because it was about taking either moments in history that had been written a certain way and examining them and seeing how you could interact with them. Were they true? Were they false? What information was considered? A lot of social history, really, looking at a collection of objects and seeing how you could read them, how you could make art, new art from them, how you could understand them through art, what was missing, what was misinterpreted, all of those sorts of stuff. It was a great way of studying history, black history, women's history, the history of art, really. And I took that also to me, the history of all those voices that had been excluding. So in terms of computer work, it's still about language, it's still about communication. And that's why I sort of started, in the end, I started to use real voices to learn how to communicate, really, rather than with impression or expression. I think that's one thing that the computer offers that's different from traditional art making, is that you have a timeline. You can form an idea rather than it just being a static image, although you still have your own interpretation, because it's always the interaction with history. Your personal history interacts with what you see, and vice versa. You know, what you make is an interaction with what you've researched or what you want to tell other people. So it becomes a dialogue, and the timeline, the computer timeline, is a way of performing a sort of an idea, really, or an emotion or an issue.
It's really interesting, and we're going to talk more about the artistic processes and thinking behind the stuff that you do a bit later on. But it sounds like, obviously, meeting Lubaina and being part of that group and then having a child, that's a huge pivotal moment, and is often the point, particularly for women, if they're creative and they decide to try and pursue their creative passions. That is often the point when they do it. I certainly did that myself. And then sort of meeting Lubaina and then going to the university, they were all sort of key moments. And then when you came out of that degree, how did you develop your career? How did they teach you to respond to commission calls? Did they teach you to create your own work and then sell it? What worked?
Well, I sort of took that master's to mean I had to work at understanding my own thinking about what I was, being confident about whatever I was doing. It didn't matter what I was doing. You had to be sort of confident, had to feel honest. You had to understand that some people wouldn't be able to understand what you were trying to say, and you had to find ways, you had to find a voice that would speak to whoever you were trying to speak to, really. But through university, I sort of realised that what I was doing wasn't classic. It was very much based in technology, a new technology at that.
And how was that sort of received, with it not being sort of traditional fine art in inverted commas?
Well, you know, all the thinking processes were still supported, so that was really useful. I think this is what these pieces are about as much as anything, trying to bridge the gap between what is considered art. Even modern art is still quite traditional in the tools that it uses, whereas computers they're not new, but they're not old either, but they can still make marks. As far as I'm concerned, it's just a tool, like a pencil. It's just a tool, really.
Yeah, I've never really thought about that before, but yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot of contemporary and modern art does use those traditional tools, and this is about using a modern tool, but you're still making art. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before. Interesting. It's also what you were saying before about having that belief in your own thinking and your own practice is so important, and also that sense of knowing that you just need to stay in your own lane.
Yeah.
And not get distracted by what people think you should be doing or what everyone else is doing.
Yeah.
That's so important. And in terms of translating that to potential commissioners or people who want to buy your work, it is about that confidence. And you can only develop that confidence if you have that self-belief and you have that very focused mindset.
Absolutely, but I think it's idealistic. I'm also quite a sort of a practical person, and I do understand that in today's world, it's very difficult to be an artist unless you're helping other people do art, either through non-traditional channels like community workshop or traditional channels, which is being a tutor in a college or a university or something like that. It's very difficult to support your own practice, to be confident about your own practice, when you probably won't get enough money to live on if that's all you're doing.
I know, and that's a big aspect of why the arts is such a difficult career path. In some ways, people worry about it, and they always have done. But I think, I'm sort of jumping ahead here a little bit, but there is this sense, particularly at the moment, and because of the way Arts Council currently are funding and the way their strategy works, it's almost as if you have to make work with other people or in connection with other people, otherwise you won't be supported. Yeah, which is strange to me. And I sort of feel like, this word engagement, which is very Arts Council, engagement or involvement from other people in the creation of art, it's really ramped up, definitely over the last 10 years that I have noticed. And as a contemporary artist, how does that affect your work? Because obviously there is always an engagement process, whether you're a contemporary artist or a community artist, but it's the motivations behind that engagement is different, and how you use that engagement to inform the work is different. And I know that you work across both spheres. You do work with community groups, but then equally you create work inspired by your own research and thinking. How does engagement, this is a really long way of saying it, but how does engagement, how has it changed over the time that you've been making work? And is it harder? Does it make it easier? It must impact on what comes out at the other end.
Well, I think even engagement changed. The language has changed in terms of engagement. When I first started 20 years ago, when I first went to that art group, I was being engaged by artists to look at art as something that's useful, culturally necessary, all of those sorts of stuff. And then when all that finished, I became the workshop facilitator who would engage people to come and do art because it would be good for them in terms of their self-esteem or confidence, or it's a new way of communicating. Come and use this to talk about your issues. But you do find issues that resonate with you through that work. So it's not like you're selling your soul. All of a sudden you find you're having conversations with people and you're seeing where art is in their lives and how art can actually support them as well. It's like a research base. You're not working on projects that don't interest you. Well, I've tried not to. I've always tried to work on projects that interest me. So like with the Living City project, that's a park I use. There's things that are wrong with it. There's lots of things that are really right with it. And for me, that was really interesting because it's something that I love the park. Kept me going through COVID. It reminds me of my childhood, walking around on the grass, all of those sorts of things. So it's a real memory activator, stimulator. If I'm working on projects that, and obviously I have to because that's how I get my money, then I do try to make it things that do interest me. I'm not going to do something about stuff that I can't myself be part of the conversation. I don't want to be an anthropological observer. I want to actually be part of the process. Although art isn't top of their agenda, it can be top of my agenda, but I can still be in the conversation because it's something that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I always say to emerging artists coming in to the industry, and they sort of feel like they've got to go for everything. And I kind of say to them, you don't go for everything, actually. That will completely dilute who you are as an artist. Just go for the things that speak to you, the things that you're interested in and that you can contribute to, and that can elevate your practice, and vice versa. I think that's so important. And because your work is around those exchanges and that exchange with those people or that place, it makes sense that you would be involved in more sort of socially engaged work, I suppose.
Absolutely, yeah. Language. One of the things that I wanted, why I was absolutely happy to do community projects and workshops and all of those sorts of stuff, is because it's another form of language, how people engage with each other. When you're working in marketing and advertising, a completely artificial structure it is another language. It's language that's manipulative. But
It's
when
not
you're
as
talking,
authentic, is it?
no, it's not authentic at all. So when you're talking to someone who grew up around a park, the passion is the honesty, and the passion is there, and that's something that I wanted to find out about. You know, you can be really tainted by sort of marketing, and television is full of that sort of language, and it's very difficult to break it down to understand that it is artificial. It's very easy to be swept away by it. When you're working on a community level, it's about what people are doing, even if it's just self-improvement. So I think that's why the Arts Council do like engagement, because it is using creativity in a really sort of quite positive way, and it's also building audience for the arts itself. They sort of see that they have to market themselves, and the most honest way to do that is to engage with people and build audience in a very organic way. I think that's why it's so important to the Arts Council, because it's the service that they provide to anonymous artists. You know, they're not doing it for one specific person, they're doing it for the general good of the cultural industries, really. I think that's why it's become so important. We're losing audience to private satellite companies who are everywhere and nowhere, who don't sort of contribute particularly to anything.
That's a really good explanation and way of looking at it, actually. You know, it is about making sure those audiences for cultural work are still there. I don't think I've spoken to anyone that's really described it in that way before, so that's really interesting. And I think the people that you're working with through the community projects, and that any artist is working with through community projects, become a collaborator in the process by default in some ways, and often purposely. And it seems to me that you work very collaboratively through all of your work. And you mentioned kitchen sink before. Can you just talk a little bit about that for those that might not know about it?
Oh, well, yeah, no, they probably don't. It was developed from this arts group, this Black Arts group, to try and find ways to support diversity in the arts, and to also help artists understand the process of getting money for community projects and stuff like that, and why it's slowly changing in something that's a sort of a not-for-profit, maybe a bit more sort of business-like, is because it can't support a very, very small amount of artists who need money now, not later. You know, they haven't got the economic means to survive 6 months while you're building a project, your first project. All of those sorts of things are really difficult, and it's even more difficult if you're doing something niche in terms of cultural expression. You know, the diversity means acknowledging that traditional arts aren't particularly inclusive. They're not multicultural. They are multicultural in terms of European based. You know, there's a lot of synergy between what a German artist understands as art, or a French artist or a British artist understands art. But if you're coming from a Commonwealth where you have an Indian artist who wants to participate in the cultural industries in Britain, or you have an artist from the Caribbean or colonial Africa, their country or their heritage plus where they live, that's quite new as well. It's more difficult. We have to acknowledge that it is more difficult, because you're trying to engage an audience who have a different language. It's English, but it's a different language. It's a different set of circumstances, and getting one to understand that and support that, because it is niche. It's the battle.
Creating work that's from a different context and presenting it to another context.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the battle, really. And I think that's like tightrope walking. It's not sides, because that sounds sort of competitive, but those two very different strands of cultural histories meet, there's a thin line, really.
Yeah, I understand that. I can really see that. And so that just put me in mind of something that I read that you had written. And I'm just going to see if I can find it now because I actually saved it. I follow on Instagram a lady called Africa Brooke, and she does a lot around helping people to move through self-sabotage and self-censorship. You might be interested in her, actually. And something that you said, which I'm just going to bring up now, really resonated with something that I've been listening to her talk about. And you said, my experiences are framed by notions of race, as everyone's are. But this dubious science of differentiation is only a small part of what it means to express culture. There are meeting points, not just bridges. And I thought that was a really beautiful way to describe, first of all, where you're coming from as an artist, but also just this sense of, particularly over the last couple of years, with everything that has been going on in the world and this feeling like the media of creating these two sides, especially around the Black Lives Matter situation. And I just thought, your work is not about sides, it's about expressing different cultures and helping people to understand a different culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And that could be, I've grown up in a working class environment, mostly white working class environment, and their voices is important, and it's important to me to hear it as well. Obviously there's a lot of resonance between feeling excluded. So there's lots of places where I'm just realising that I've been saying the same thing without even realising it, actually. That's quite interesting. It's about meetings, about communication, telling stories. That's my absolute passion, I think.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm glad. This is how you come to these realizations. Someone else. So kitchen sink then, that's still a thing? It's still happening?
It is, yeah. And I'm thinking about how to make it into something that can support people economically, really. So an engine for feeding diversity into the arts, but also being able to pay people to help do that.
A lot of your work is made in collaboration with people. It involves lots of conversation and exchanges. And one of the things that I noticed, your earlier work had those exchanges, but they were more observational in style, and they used type to ask questions on the screen rather than voice. And I just noticed that more recently you have been using your own voices in there, and other people's actual voices are in there. And I just wondered whether that was a subconscious thing, or whether it was a purposeful thing, or whether it come about because of COVID and this need to interact with people more because of the enforced social distance, or whether it was simply because, you had access to better technology. I mean,
No, it was a conscious decision, and it was completely about being able to talk to people authentically and with my own voice, and engaging people with my own voice, and being able to tell a story, whether it's a true story or a story made from research. I realised that I'd spent a vast amount of my life actually not really talking, doing, working, blah, 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 going dancing, whatever, but not actually talking and engaging in conversation. And especially if you've got a child, you really need to be able to communicate honestly.
Why do you think you hadn't been engaging in those conversations before?
Because the rush of life, of being on this journey with technology as well through my working life, there's lots of software you have to learn, all the dance of being able to use technology. And also, for an example, there was a big insurance company, it was a freelance project, all piling in, going to Spain for a couple of days for a big conference, and we had to do all the technology, the graphics, blah, blah, blah. So I went there, and there's about 8 or 9 of us, and they're all blokes. They're all sort of nerdy techno blokes, and me. So, what do you talk about when they're all slightly younger, slightly unable to communicate themselves because their head is completely in a computer as well? They're in a foreign country. So, what do you talk about?
So you're in a lot of situations like that?
Yeah, they've circled the wagons because they're feeling vulnerable. So you don't talk. They'll go off and go find a meal or do whatever those boys do, and you're there sort of, right, well, I'll have a sandwich and then it's bedtime because it's Spanish television or whatever.
You didn't feel comfortable, or there wasn't that meeting of minds really to be able to feel like you could
No, it was
engage?
definitely no. I think they saw me as not someone who could support their vulnerability, really. So it was quite excluding, and you do find yourself observing in silence, how they interact with each other, how they interact with the client, all of those sorts of stuff while you're sort of working. So yeah, observation was how the world and me sort of interacted, yeah. But slowly, as you settle down in a place where people do talk and you begin to communicate and you begin to talk, and if you haven't really done it for most of your working life, you need practice. So maybe I was using community art myself. We were all in it together. I had genuine need to sort of learn how to communicate.
That's really, really interesting. And I think for artists coming in to work with communities, for the first time, I think to acknowledge the fact that nobody has all the answers, even if you've been doing it for many, many years. And I think that's really important, that you don't have to present a finished product. You don't have to come up with the solutions. It is just about having those equal exchanges.
Yeah, very much so. Learning about yourselves, what you want, and all of those sorts of things. We can all do that. What I wonder about with that approach from the Arts Council is that it does rely on issue based, and that's not necessarily very optimistic, is it? Thinking there's always going to be issues that need to be explored and resolved and all that sort of stuff. It's not really celebratory.
There's no arts for art's sake.
Yeah,
it's just an observation more than anything. I mean, obviously, I personally do a lot with working with communities, but I'm always wondering, sort of in the back of my mind, because I'm working with contemporary artists as well who don't do that, and I kind of think, well, how are contemporary artists going to continue if all the commissions are around this?
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's a question for another day, really.
It's a caution, really. It's a cautionary.
It's just a different approach. I think there's room for both.
Oh yeah.
How do artists who also want to make contemporary work, how do they develop their careers? Just to move on to the contemporary aspect, the process and the artistic process connected to your work.
Okay.
I just find it's so emotive and it's so sensory how you layer everything, because it's hugely layered and it's very immersive. I got lost in it a bit, and my husband was like, "What are you watching? What are you watching?" And I was like, "I don't know. I can't take my eyes off it."
Not sure. Not
this
sure.
Is the bus station. I was trying to explain it. But it's really hypnotic. I think that's what it is. And I just wondered whether you could talk a little bit about your artistic process, because for me, I was like, how do artists decide what to include and what to take out? And I once read a book about Chanel. She always advised people that before you go out the house in the morning, take one thing off. That was how you curate your look. And in terms of art, are there rules that you sort of apply?
You have to find the place where you stop. You have to find the place where you have left yourself enough freedom to go and do something else. And as a working artist, that's one of the sort of most important things in terms of your professional practice, is that moment when you say, said whatever I was going to say, that said it. If I do anything else, I'm going to cover up my message or my idea or the beauty of what I've just done. A place where you have to stop to be safe. That's a really good way of putting it. That's a really good way of understanding. And it's one of those things that you understand as you sort of build your career, really, is that you can't give it all to everything that you do, because it's a profession. The idea of the artist dragging some sort of emotional question out into the open and destroying their life doing it is, for most of us, it's not the way to be. You have to find a place where you're still safe. Whatever you do, you could make something hugely controversial, but on a practical career and personal level, you have to say, well, whatever that was, I've done it and I'm still here and I'm going to go and do something else now. And I've got to make my next piece if I want to earn some money. So wherever that stop is for you have to do it. And I think probably in saying all of that, you have to slightly go over that stop to understand where it is. You have to nearly make that mistake.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So would you describe it as a feeling then of knowing where that line is?
Yeah, because that's what these studies are about to a certain extent, is that you have to play a little bit. You have to be bright about whatever you're doing, whether it's dark or it's intense, or there has to be a brightness to it. And I think this is why I like computers so much. You're having a conversation, you're telling a story. This is what, for me anyway, that computers give me. This timeline enables you to say, this is what happened, this is what I'm feeling, and you can perform it through the timeline.
So do you feel that timeline almost acts as a bit of a backstop, a container?
Yeah, definitely. But the same caution still applies, because the timeline is infinite. Lubaina Himid did a 12-hour live performance piece, and it was absolutely fantastic. So there's the other side. She's saying, sort of commercially, if you want to be commercially viable, you have to find a place where it's safe to stop, because you know you're going to have to make another piece, or for her another collection, next year or next month or next project or whatever. There's the Chanel approach, but then there's the Abramovich approach, which is just ride it to death. I'm gonna stand by this wall for every day for 12 hours for the next 3 weeks. I'm gonna create an atmosphere through my body by everybody coming to see me stand by this wall. My body becomes a performing vehicle. It's possible to work that way, but it takes a lot from the audience. Yeah, absolutely. It takes. You have to train the audience to understand that work.
I will put a link to Lubaina Himid in the show notes then as well, because I think that would be really interesting for people to have a look at.
Yeah, because she was in Manchester as well. It's like she was here. You know what I mean? She's not some distant sort of star.
So, I mean, technology, obviously, it plays a huge part in your work. And you've already mentioned how much it's accelerated over the last 30 years. How do you keep up with it? You've talked about how your work in graphic design almost was like a training ground for you in so much of it. But practically speaking, getting access to all these new technologies coming out, particularly now, virtual reality, augmented reality, all those kind of things.
Yeah.
Do you feel like a pressure to sort of always be learning this new stuff? And how does the introduction of all this new technology impact on the work that you then create?
I stopped engaging with emerging technologies. I stopped interacting with it when I was priced out of the market. When sort of abstract animation started, these guys were working in film units, had easy access to film technology, traditional 35mm film and all of those sorts of stuff. And then there was this huge sort of personal computer where we all had access to it. And now there's another layer that we don't have access to, because the processing power that you'd need to make it is way beyond the capacity of anyone who fancied having a go. And the only people that will pay for it, because it's so expensive, are those people that can use it, which is like television studios and massive sort of organisations who train people to use it. There's simpler technologies, there's simpler channels of communication that I'm thinking about in terms of digital publishing. You can tell a story, you can tell a story on somebody's phone, they can listen to it in terms of an audio book or computer. If they wanted to, that they could just fling onto their television and then they could have their own niche broadcast or whatever. So there's lots of potential. Without going to the extremes of massive data sort of ideas, trying to analyse or trying to be artistic about data and stuff. I'm just into storytelling. There's a massive market there, and so why sort of ring fence yourself off to do something that people won't
be able to access themselves.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, because the Arts Exchange this year is all about augmented creativity, so that the intersection between technology and arts. But I think it is definitely worth remembering that not everybody has access or enough data to look at these amazing creations that are made with all this new technology. And until it gets to a point where it is affordable and everybody has the technology to be able to engage with it.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a misnomer, really, isn't it? So you mentioned you're really interested in storytelling and how that can be done in different ways. Is there any sort of technology or any platforms or apps that you're really looking into at the moment that you're wanting to use to create new work?
To do that, no, because it's all there now. I've got the tools that I need.
I think that sort of leads on to the question, really. Over the last couple of years with COVID, audiences for culture have been accessing artworks, whether performance or visual artworks online through a screen.
Yeah.
And people have adapted quite quickly to that, and their expectations of what they want to see and what the quality of what they want to see has rocketed in a very short space of time, which puts the pressure on artists then to be making work of the quality that an audience expects, which may not always be possible.
That's true.
So I just wondered whether you had experienced that over the last couple of years, and also whether as a result of it, it made you think about how you make your work in a different way, or whether you have plans to do anything slightly differently.
Well, I definitely think you're right about quality, the quality of the product. If you've got something really interesting, really important, or really sort of engaging to say, if you then have to go through a process of developing it to such quality because people are expecting, massive green screen production of something that's quite sort of simple, then there's an issue. But there must be a way of doing it. I think that's the challenge for artists, is to find a way of doing it. I particularly remember from conversations with Lubaina, who you're talking to, who do you want to have this conversation with? It's like Turner. He'd make these lovely paintings for the academy, but then he'd make prints and he'd colour prints for everybody else. Artists have always understood that you can't support your family.
Different audiences, isn't there?
Yeah, and you
products for different audiences.
Or different means of production for different audiences. They can't afford to have me stand around painting for 6 months, painting this historic scene of such and such. But they might like to see it as a lino print. Maybe that's the way of putting it. They're valuable. They're completely valuable to me. I can't repeat them. I can't do them again. That's a moment there that is of me, and I've never investigated how that could be valuable to somebody else, because I've never had that sort of, an agent maybe would be able to tell me, or something. I don't know. I've no steps into that world at all that I could sort of describe how to make that.
Well, that's I'm interested in it because I've sort of been reading a lot around it, and I can see all these pieces of digital art, some which are excellent, some which are, just very strange and questionable quality. But yet people are buying the ownership rights to them and making a lot of money for themselves and for the artist in the process. So I'm interested to know how it works, and I'm wanting to do a bit more of a deep dive into it, maybe program around it where we can actually find out, what are NFTs, how do you make them, what do they do for artists?
Yeah, I think that'd be really good, because I've absolutely no idea. That's just,
Yeah, I think it'd be good to know, but also there's an environmental aspect to them in that the CO2, I think it's the CO2 emissions from the creation of these NFTs are huge. So that's an issue, but it's something that I want to look into as a potential route for artists to make that sort of passive income, I guess, that allows them to continue their normal practice.
Yeah. I think definitely worth an investigation then, isn't it? Because if there's possibilities for creative producers to do something to get money, I think that's completely valid, isn't it? That's absolutely.
I think it's about acknowledging that there's lots of different ways to make it happen for yourself if you want to follow your creative passions, really.
Yeah. I think any tool.
Crypto art.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
I don't.
It might be not something you've thought about at all. I don't know.
Absolutely not. No, because it's never been a possibility before. Do you know what I mean? And it's just sort of, well, it was not a possibility. I want to make this thing anyway, so I'm going to make it, and there it is. Sort of thing. And that's helped me have a conversation with somebody, another artist. It's helped me do all of those sorts of things, and I have to be happy with that. And then it's on to the next thing. This whole sort of movement that we were talking about before. So, no one stuck that in front of me and said, this might be something that can help you. Yeah, or that.
Yeah. Well, it just struck me when I was looking at your work. I did think, gosh, if that was a route Chantal wanted to go down, she could probably do quite well.
Right.
But I don't know enough about it, and I need to do some more research into it. But I think a lot of people would be interested in it, so it might be something that I try and build something around. So that
yeah, definitely. Oh, yeah, definitely, Alex. Anything that you can, any information, any sort of support or anything to do with that would be most, something that I can pass on, even if I can't use it myself, it's something that I could pass on as a technology. Because, like I said, people now, if you can't afford to be an artist or to get started and all of that sort of stuff, but you still want to do it, these are the ways that
exactly
you actually might be able to support yourself. This might be a string to your bow. This might be an avenue of revenue.
Exactly. Just got to work out what the environmental impact is, because I wouldn't want to be.
No, I don't understand why there is an environmental impact. Why is there?
I don't quite get it. I don't know enough, but it's something to do with the I don't know. I can't explain it. I can't explain it. It's got something to do with miners, but they're not actual miners. I don't know. Something to do with, I don't know.
Right. Oh, that sounds like a task for both of you. Non-fungible. Right. I'll have a little investigation.
Yeah, I'll send you some links, because I've been thinking about it, and it doesn't make sense when I'm reading it, and then I come away and what does that mean? And I can't explain it. It's basically, it's like I've gone back into GCSE maths. Do it when the teacher's telling me what to do.
Yeah. Oh, I'm there.
Can't do it. So yeah, we'll look into that.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's finish then on talking about the work that you are actually bringing to the Lancashire Arts Exchange, which is called Still Lives. That's going to be presented at the Harris. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that work is and how it came about?
There's studies that are based in an exploration of how do artists and audience understand that the digital is as much art or an art tool as pencils, paint, mark making in a very physical sense. What's the physicality of using the digital to make work, and also what is the difference between making a piece that you study in order to find your emotional sort of response to, and something that sort of gives it to you, really, is using the television as it's always been used, as a sort of a passive engagement process. You sit in front of the television, and you sit in front of the cinema, and it provides you with an emotional experience, which is, to me, what the digital does. Provides you with an emotional experience, but actually it's making marks as much as somebody who uses a pencil or paint to make a picture. You're still making a picture, but you're using a timeline. So trying to illustrate that argument that there is a similarity between the two processes, to illustrate how the digital can enhance a static product, which I think has been done quite a lot. People were taking sort of fairies out of Dutch masters and stuff like that, taking small elements out of them and animating them and flying them around walls and things like that. Do you remember? Yeah. So I think that was how people were experimenting with the interaction between what's static, what's been before, and the possibilities that the digital have to reinvigorate image, tell a story with that image, something like that. It was a whole sort of process of thinking, really. How do you make people understand what you're saying? How do you sort of begin the sort of to show a path between abstract and something that's obviously instantly sort of recognisable. I think all of those arguments were going on in my head when I was putting them together, putting the two together. I was making these very abstract animations. Steve, who's contributed to the drawings, was making these. Well, they're not particularly traditional, but they are traditional in terms of what people understand to be art. You know, the beautiful drawings that he was making, and how people don't understand the abstract very much. There's not been very much positive sort of discussion about what abstract says, what it means, what it enables, you know, the dialogue between the artist and audience. And so, you know, sort of worried about that. I can make completely abstract pieces, but unless they talk to somebody else, unless they talk to the people that I want to talk to, where can I produce value for them as an audience when what I want to make is something that's sort of really quite abstract and
how do you connect
difficult.
them? How do you connect them to the meaning?
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? Abstract, anything abstract really has been vaguely sort of dismissed because of its difficulty, because of
it's not literal. I think that's the whole point of it, isn't it? I mean, obviously I've seen the work already, and I just find it really meditative, and it's beautiful. And I think when people see it, they will understand what you're saying and find the meaning in that.
I hope so. At the end of the day, it's that's all I really want to do is just, you know, use language that people sort of understand really.
Thanks for listening to The Gathering. If you like this episode, let us know in the reviews, and don't forget to share it with your friends. For show notes, links to all the organisations and initiatives mentioned in this episode, and much more, head over to www.artslancashire.org.uk/thegathering. You can also follow us on Twitter @Arts Lancashire.